long term, Germany today is a thriving democracy and has a lot of success, and it went through a very tough period, right? So, it's like long term, it could still be in the medium term, including like the rest of my lifetime.
Hmm.
Things could be really, really ugly. I think that there are a lot of people who are so frustrated with politics that they're willing to give up basic democratic principles like congressional representation, and they don't respect the role that those things play. They don't understand the role that plays, and we don't do a very good job of defending that. So things, I mean, right now things look pretty grim.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig. American politics is clearly at some type of crossroads. The Republican Party, once synonymous with traditional conservatism, has been reshaped into a vehicle for Trumpism, blending populism, nationalism, and an unrelenting loyalty to its figurehead, Donald Trump himself. At the same time, the Democratic Party finds itself adrift, grappling with internal divisions about how to approach the Trump presidency and struggling to define a cohesive vision, what the Democratic Party is, after losses in the 2024 election. All of this matters because as we're living through and experiencing right now, the weaker the parties are, the less able they are to act as a bulwark against the rise of authoritarianism under Donald Trump. Today's guest is Dr. Hans Noel, Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University, leading expert on political parties and American democracy, and co-author of the book Political Parties. He's here to help answer some questions, like how did Trump consolidate his grip on the GOP and transform it into an extension of his MAGA movement? Why are Democrats unable to rally around a clear strategy or leader? And what does this mean for the country? Could this political alignment offer an opportunity for renewal? Or are we truly witnessing the unraveling of democratic norms and democracy itself? All right, if you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Dr. Noel, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So a lot of focus on party ID and partisanship over the past decade has really been on the evolution of the Republican Party into one that is wholly Trumpist, largely MAGA. But there does seem to be a shift in the Democratic Party as well. And I think we saw glimmers of that in the 2015-2016 race, that Bernie Sanders was really exposing a rift in the Democratic Party that was probably, in retrospect, more enduring than perhaps we all realized at the time. And this past election shows just how real shifting alliances and identifications seem to be in our politics. And I guess it remains to be seen how permanent this realignment is, but the reality is that it's not limited to the Republican Party, and it is impacting our entire country. And I want to work our way through, the impact or the form that this is taking within each of the parties. But perhaps before we even get there, we should just, establish whether or not you think that there actually is some type of a realignment that we're living through. And if so, what the impact is that it might be having on our politics.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good place to start. I mean, the concept of a realignment in political science is, sometimes pretty precise. And we talk about, that there's this major change of groups that are in the parties moving from one party into the other, or what the parties stand for is changing. And in the sort of big picture way that we might talk about, a complete realignment of the Republican Party from the, Lincoln era, when the party was mainly about ending slavery and then other things, to today, when the party is principally the party that is most embracing of, say, the Confederate flag or symbols of the Old South. That kind of realignment, no, I don't think we're seeing something quite that big. But I also think political science saw some really big moments in the past and said, these are really big shifts. And so we have this really high bar for what it amounts to as a realignment. What I think we're seeing now is there are some, more gradual shifts. The two parties remain the two parties, much of what they stand for remains very similar. There's more of a shift in focus than in any actual things that they care about or switching sides on policies. Some, but not mostly. And so broadly, the coalitions are similar, but voters are new generation of voters are responding to those coalitions a little bit differently, and there's some other changes. And so there are some very gradual changes. And of course, it's hard to know where those are going. And so I do think there's something happening under the surface, but it's not the kind of realignment where we're going to say in 20 or 30 years, we have completely new parties.
So one of the narratives about what's happened with the Republican Party, if we start with them, is that they've been completely reshaped and reformed into being essentially sycophantic Trumpist, and that it is divorced from, and I guess this cuts a little bit against what you've just said, so maybe we need to dig into the nuance here, but that it's divorced from the traditional kind of conservative identification that sits comfortably within the Republican Party, that it's become much more populist and nationalist, that it's moved away from being elite driven, which in and of itself, this last point isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that it's become something that is not at all characteristic of what it used to be. So I guess I'm wondering how we would characterize the current identity of the Republican Party. And if you say that it is largely built of the same components, then how does that comport with this narrative?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the narrative is true, that there is a general shift in the last decade or so towards Trumpism and whatever Trump stands for. But the underlying material that Trump is working with is still Republican conservative policies. And so one way to think about that is conservatives tended to be very pro free trade, and Trump is not, right? So there's a reversal there. But it is still the case that the kinds of policies Trump is advancing are fiscal conservative. Let's not spend too much money. Let's not have tax policies that are especially punitive on the rich. These kinds of things that were Republican principles before. And some of his argument about tariffs even is not so much about I'm going to want to implement tariffs to change and bring back, lots of support for working class jobs, although that is part of what he says, but also, building American industry in general, top to bottom, including especially the top. And so there's changes for sure. And there's a lot about Trump that is, at wild odds with the past Republican coalition. But it doesn't seem like there's this completely new group of people. It is the case that most activists look at Trump and say that's where the Republican Party is, and that's what conservatism is. And so if you ask them who is more conservative, they'll say that Trump favoring politicians are more conservative, even if they are not more conservative on sort of more traditional things like, say, free trade. But that shift is more about emphasis. It used to be that some conservatives were really concerned about immigration and national identity, and Trump has taken that as one of the elements of the Republican Party and put it right at the top. The other big thing that Trump has shifted the Republican Party about is about himself, his personal policy questions, like his own legal challenges and his his how much power he should have and those kinds of things. And that's not really that wild to have a party backing their own president on those kind of personal things. It's just Trump has a lot of them, and he really does push them hard. And there are very few politicians who are defecting in the way that, say, many Democrats defected from Clinton during the Lewinsky scandal.
Mm-hmm. Often the construction or the structure of a party is the reflection of some strike of a balance between elites within the party and their representation of what they believe the Republican Party or conservatism should be, balanced against what the Republican or conservative electorate is hoping that the party is. And we're living through a time where it feels as if Trump embodies the entirety of Republican identity. And I think one argument is that some evidence of this is the fact that Republicans in Congress are ceding a lot of control to Trump as opposed to exerting some of their own. And I think the argument here is that if they felt like they had their finger on the pulse of the Republican Party at the electorate level, that they would feel a bit more empowered to flex some of that muscle in Congress, but that they're instead being a bit reflexive And I wonder if that is a signifier that the Republican Party at the elite level in Congress isn't quite sure who or what the Republican Party at the electorate level is and is just taking their cues from Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and maybe not just taking them from Trump, but using what they've learned from Trump's success to tell something about what Republican voters want. And so it used to be, for instance, that the argument was that Republicans used social issues and populist appeals to try to bring around voters, and then you turn around and they would vote for economic policies that benefit the wealthy and business owners. And to some degree, that's still happening because Trump is okay with policies in some cases that help big businesses. But exactly what kind and how far that's going to go and whether or not you really want to fully embrace it is something that a lot of Republican leaders are now saying, well, maybe we don't need to or we shouldn't go towards some of these more traditional conservative economic policies because we do want to get this growing working class element in our party. And that means, policies that are oriented towards helping the working class. But you'll notice that the way they talk about it still is, unions are still the problem, right? And we want to embrace working class voters that are not in unionized jobs, and we want to have less government, and saying that it's government policies that are making problems for the working class. So there's a lot of continuity in the kinds of issues. And it's more, the places where there is a shift, Trump is showing that that's more electorally successful.
So if we look at this through the lens of history, I guess I want to take head on or discuss head on this argument that the Republican Party in its current configuration is an existential threat to democracy in the United States. And I think there are probably elements of our politics generally that could play to that argument. But I do wonder if we look at this through, like I said, the lens of history and the evolution of parties and party ID and shifts in alignments and realignments, if this is something that we could expect to see at any given time. The politics that we're living through are something that we could expect to see at periods of time in which there are alignments, or if there are elements here that are truly concerning.
So I think there's a mix of things, and then maybe there's like 4 levels of things that we want to think about when we talk about like threats to democracy, and that often get lumped together, especially for Democrats who see this threat. I mean, first, there's just a lot of policies that Democrats don't like, and they think make us a different country than they want to have, and those are not. That's different disagreements, and maybe the Democrats are right about how important those policies are, but that's not about lack of Democratic representation. That's just a policy difference. There's also some policy differences that are more fundamental about citizenship and what it means to be an American that I'd sort of call, illiberal policies that some of the Republicans are advancing. And those, I think people have a reasonable connection to. If you start saying certain kinds of people don't belong here, that used to belong here, then that can be sort of eroding of the notion of American identity, and therefore erodes, the republic and our logic of democracy. But it's still not exactly a threat directly to democracy. It's a threat to something like what kind of democracy we're going to be. And then there's things that are like, I think, threats to sort of constitutional order and the rule of law, where the Constitution says that Congress gets to decide how we spend money and what agencies are going to exist. And yet Trump seems to be saying, no, he gets to decide what those things are going to be. And he's signing and issuing executive orders that, invade on Congress's territory and the like. And so that starts to get to be like, well, that's, it's not strictly undemocratic in that, he was democratically elected. So that's the case. But our, democracy isn't just, is there voting going on? But, we have a system that is based on, checks and balances and constitutional order of who gets to make these kinds of decisions. And there's a threat there. And I think that's pretty legitimately a concern. And then there are some things that seem to like actually undermine the ability of the country to have democratic elections. And there are a lot of elements in the Republican coalition's views about democracy that democracy scholars worry about. So there's a really excellent book by Jacob Grumbach, which I just happened to be reading with my students, called Laboratories Against Democracy. And his argument is that because politics at the national level has gotten so polarized, national parties now are shaping state party policy in many different ways, including especially in how democracy is run. So things like, whether or not you have early voting or who's allowed to vote, or how absentee ballots are handled, or whether you have mail-in ballots and all those kinds of things. And he builds a scale out of that talks about like how democratic, or how good for democracy are each state's policies. And he shows that in states that have Republicans in control, there's less less of what he calls democracy. Now, it's worth noting that his scale is a scale that gives you points for having early voting and mail-in voting, and would take away from how democratic it is if you have voter ID laws and other restrictions, which Republicans would say, no, those are empowering our democracy. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of, sort of scholars of democracy would say that the Republican view on what is empowering a democracy and what is not is incorrect. And so then that does that does look like it's a threat, but it's a threat that's got an ideological component to it, of Republicans thinking that these things that other people think are democracy actually aren't.
So let's switch and talk a little bit about the Democratic Party. And before we dig into the party today and what it might be struggling with, I prefaced in the preamble this idea that maybe Bernie Sanders was a warning sign to the structure of the Democratic Party in 2015, 2016 in a way that the party didn't take seriously. But I don't want to posit that as a fact. So I guess I'm wondering if you think that was a moment that suggests the party was losing touch with a certain segment of its base, or if there's something else that we could point to.
So I think, there's a lot of different cleavages within both parties. Like, American parties are coalitions, and they're made up of, people who might even disagree with each other on important stuff, but they decide, broadly speaking, they're on the same side, and agree with roughly the same ideology. And so those cleavages are, that there are cleavages isn't new, and that there is a cleavage between the sort of working class Democrat and then the sort of more educated, sort of more white collar type Democrat is not new. But the degree to which Democratic policy had moved, Democratic Party priorities, the degree to which Democratic Party priorities had sort of shifted to more cultural issues, things that are not the sort of bread and butter for union members and working class, that had been happening. It is real. Some of it's because it's hard to make changes in the economic policy, and it might be easier to make changes on the sort of civil rights front. Some of it's because of the decline in union membership, which means that the power of unions within politics in general, and also within the Democratic Party, is weakening. All right. And so I don't think it's true that the Democratic Party was just ignoring that this was happening, but it had been happening, and there was a trend in that direction. And Sanders caught onto it and emphasized it. There's a certain, aspect of when you start to make an issue out of a cleavage like this and highlight it in this way and use the kind of rhetoric that, politicians who are seeking the presidency tend to use, then that amplifies it, right? Like before the Bernie Sanders runs, a lot of working class voters would have been like, yeah, that Democratic Party is probably the better party for us, and they're not doing as much as we'd like, but that's our party. And then Sanders says, oh, well, the Democrats don't care about you. And then afterwards, they're like, oh, maybe the Democrats don't care about me. And then they start thinking, oh, well, what else does? And they see Trump there. I don't want to blame Sanders per se, but that this comes up, and then it starts to shape people's views of what the party stands for. And a different reaction of the Democratic Party that more embraced some of the elements of Sanders' policies, although it's worth noting that not all of his things, both make sense or are necessarily better for the working class, but embraced some of that appeal. Might have forestalled some of those shifts in working class voters towards the Republican Party. It's also worth noting that while there is a shift on this, this cleavage is real, and there are a lot of working class voters who are now thinking of looking elsewhere. It's not the case that working class voters are now a solid Republican bloc. It's that they're more divided, which they didn't used to be.
Mm. So if we look at the Republican or the Democratic Party today, the story is that the party is adrift. It's in the wilderness. It's vulnerable and it's weak. And I think there was a moment after the, Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade that the Democratic response in that election year was to run essentially against, at least in part, against that SCOTUS decision. And there was a concern in the back of my mind that this wasn't a proactive agenda. This was more of a reactive agenda, and that wasn't sustainable. And I think in this last election, it felt much the same to me that the Democrats were running on a reactive agenda and not a proactive agenda. And I wonder if that helps explain where they are now, in that between 2015, what happened in that election, and now that the Democratic Party hasn't really figured out how to develop a proactive agenda. But I also wonder if that might be ignoring some of the work that doesn't get enough attention that came out of the Biden administration. And so the question here really is, like, what do you think is happening with the Democratic Party right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that, like broadly speaking, that narrative probably has some truth to it. But I do think that it overstates a lot of things, which is, I mean, that's the conventional wisdom, but it overstates a lot of things. I think the first thing is that we tend to look at things like, oh, now the Democrats are adrift and they're in disarray and this is where we are today. But, they just lost an election. Meanwhile, everyone was saying something very similar about the Republican Party 2 years ago, when after the SCOTUS decision on abortion, Republicans did much, much less well than you would have otherwise expected in that condition. And people thought Republicans were also, doing, had taken a blow in 2020, but now it was like, oh, it's really a blow. But of course, you go back to 2016, and then we're back in the same place where, like, how did they possibly lose this election? And Democrats are unsure how to manage this new shift in what the party stands for, what the working class wants, and all these things. And in fact, if you go back pretty much in the year or so after every election, the losing party is, sort of panicked, trying to figure out what to do and how to regain their position. Sometimes the good strategies come out of that. Sometimes they don't. And so some of that's just normal behavior. We're just had an election. And so the Democratic Party is, in fact, trying to figure out how to react to the 2024 loss and how to build something going forward. And so that's just that happens. I also think it's true that in 2022, the Roe v. Wade issue did help Democrats. I don't think it was the only thing that helped Democrats, but I think it did help them. And I think on balance, it was probably also a good issue for 2024. It's just that, it was now into the past a little bit, and it wasn't, it wasn't very proactive, as you say. It was reacting to something that was now several years into the past. And I think the Democratic Party does need to figure out a way to reestablish its brand, and it's working to do that. But that's sort of the natural thing. It's what the Republicans felt like they needed to do after 2012. They needed to reestablish their brand. They said they were going to do it by backing off of some of the immigration issues. Instead, that's not what ended up happening. And it turns out embracing immigration even more forcefully turned out to be politically effective. But of course, a lot of the variation in what happens in the elections is beyond the party's direct control anyway. The COVID event shook up incumbents, and it shook incumbents across the world. And so I don't want to say this, absolves Biden or the Biden administration for any responsibility for what they did. I think there were a lot of policy moves that they could have done maybe that would have been better, but they've got to do this in sort of in the context of these bigger shifts that sometimes there's nothing that can be done about them. But then afterwards we draw stories based on what happened that may or may not be true. And then, of course, they become self-reinforcing if we decide that this is what happened and therefore the party has to change and therefore it tries to change and it struggles and et cetera.
This might be more of an observation than a question, but I have been somewhat fascinated in the Democratic response this past election, particularly because it's not like it was a blowout. This election was won for the Republican Party by a 1.5 point margin, and Democrats did pick up in the House. They lost in the Senate, but again, that wasn't a blowout. So I'm a little surprised at how existential the Democratic Party seems to be taking this past election. So maybe this is a bit removed from your research per se, but it's surprising to me that the Democratic Party is reacting this way, and I think they do have some footing to fight back. And I wonder if this is more as a result of what seems like momentum on the Republican Party side, or if they might be seeing something in the tea leaves that I'm just missing.
Well, and I think you're right that, I mean, it's definitely an incredibly close election, and yet the, sort of way we talk about it is that, oh, it was this huge change. And I think in the back of a lot of people's minds as well, but okay, in 2 years or in 4 years, there'll be another election, and maybe then, that'll be the chance to have some change. And it's just, it feels existential because 2 years is a long time, especially with an administration that is doing so much so quickly, that, seems threatening. It'd be something else if the administration was just sort of like, puttering along the way that oftentimes they do in a sort of polarized gridlock kind of policy setting. But I think part of it is that this sort of story of that there's chaos feeds on itself. I mean, the first half of our conversation was all about there's this chaos, and so that's what we're saying, and everybody else is saying that. I'm sure that there are some Democratic Party leaders, in fact, this may explain why it seems like Democrats are not doing very much, who are like, okay, we have to tough it out, but our brand will bounce back, especially after a year of Trump and Doge and all the chaos that's happening. But there's not an election right now, so what we just have to do is, start to build and plan ahead, and maybe keep our powder dry, and then we'll jump, out in a year with this tactic, and then that looks like paralysis and lack of direction. But it is also true that there is a lot of different direction that different Democrats want to have. And when you're in this moment of, I don't know which direction I go, then that empowers people to say, let's push it in my direction. So it's why you're hearing these, like, here's the abundance agenda. Let's make that be our thing. No, we need to embrace a more, progressive, bolder, Bernie Sanders style direction of the party or whatever. And those are fights that are always going to be in the background, but they're now foreground because there's not much else for the party to do.
One of the arguments that Democrats and the Democratic Party often give when they're on the losing side of an election is that they're a big tent party. They have a lot of people to please, a lot of groups to please, a lot of constituencies in a way that the Republican Party doesn't. But in this past election, while we might not be seeing a wholesale realignment amongst the electorate or within the electorate, it is true that the Republican Party does seem to be benefiting from a shift in vote from some percentage of working class voters and voters of color away from the Democrats. And it remains to be seen if that's enduring, if that's personality based, if that is, ideologically based. So that, that's all to come. But if that's true, it suggests that the Republican Party might also be inheriting the same problem that the Democratic Party had, if we buy this argument that the big tent is a difficult tent to make happy. And so that there are vulnerabilities in this coalition for the Republican Party. And so that's one thing I think we could talk about. But I think the thing further down the road is that if the Democratic Party remains to some degree a big tent party, and the Republican Party is also building a coalition that makes it a big tent party, if that also suggests that we are in for a tumultuous period of time as both parties are really struggling to keep their constituencies happy in a way that at least the Republican Party maybe didn't have to so extensively in the past.
Yeah, so I think generally that we should think of both parties as big tent parties, and that they always have been. They have to be because we have only two, and they're both trying to get majorities. And so, like in the sort of peak pre-Trump period, when we're talking about sort of like, George W. Bush and McCain and Romney, like the Republican Party was they talked about the Republican Party as this three-legged stool, and it had the social conservatives and the economic and fiscal conservatives, and it had the foreign policy hawks, and these three different groups oftentimes didn't have very much at all to do with each other. They were a big tent. And in fact, as one of the things that Trump had discovered was that this tent, didn't have people who were embracing all of those legs of the stool, that the social conservative folks who had sort of like this America first, let's protect our interests, less immigration. We want to have it's a particular picture of what it means to be American, which for some people is white, but also for some people, whether it's whatever the race is, it still has a particular set of values and views, what it means to be American, and that was what matters. And the fiscal conservatism and free trade and some of the foreign policy hawkishness. None of that stuff didn't matter as much to those people, and maybe they didn't even like it. And so Trump managed to like appeal to this group by dropping some of the pieces of the Republican big tent. But meanwhile, those pieces are still there, and without them, he's not going to win. He's managed to amplify this other part of the story. So I do think that though, if there's more working class voters is becoming more part of the Republican coalition, then yeah, there's going to need to be some delivery on that. There's going to need to be policies that actually. It's one thing to say, oh, the Democrats are not doing a good enough job, and they're letting inflation happen, and wages aren't growing. So see, look, they say they're your friend, but they're not. It's something else to then go a term without actually delivering anything to that group. And so some of them won't go in that direction. I think the other thing to note is, when it comes to voters of color, there's a shift there. And I think some of it's just that, many voters who are, especially as we make, sort of progress on racial issues, the issues are, other issues matter to them more. A lot of Black voters are socially conservative and conservative in other ways. They voted the Democratic Party because it's been an important part of sort of what it means to be a Black American. But that is breaking down, perhaps, especially for younger voters. And so other things matter for them. But it's still the case that, non-white voters are overwhelmingly voting for the Democratic Party, and non-white voters for whom their racial identity is really important. That continues to be how they vote. The other elements in the working class is more complicated in that, it depends a little bit on how you define the working class. We used to sort of think about it as just sort of like an income level thing, but obviously that's not quite right. And, there's a lot of, working class voters who, make quite a lot of money and maybe run small businesses, but didn't go to college and don't think of themselves as elite or, well-to-do or in the elite part of the country. And so there's this like notion of a, laptop class versus the, real working class. And some of that isn't about income at all. And I think it's actually not, with analyses that focus on that and say, see, look, these are the haves and have-nots are wrong. But it is a real cultural and social difference. And so there's a kind of working class appeal that Republicans have and that Democrats seem to have lost in, embracing academic ideas and, all the things that get labeled woke. And so Democrats now are having to hold that coalition together. And yeah, I think Republicans will now also have to try to hold that coalition together. And it may be that the working class voters become increasingly a swing group in the way that they hadn't been. And then, of course, that presumably means both parties are going to try to compete for them, and that that might actually work out to their advantage. Who knows?
I suppose there's another cleavage here that might be explaining this a bit more, but also might suggest that this is maybe more of an enduring issue, and that is the male-female cleavage.
Mm-hmm.
The Democratic Party has always been cast as being weaker, kind of across the board. And the Republican Party has always been, this is obviously an oversimplification, but the Republican Party is cast as being stronger kind of across the board. And as long as that's being cast or molded and shaped along the male-female divide, I do wonder if this last election, if it reflects that, suggests that it will be more difficult if this image holds or this characterization holds for Democrats to attract the male vote back from the Republican Party.
Yeah, I'm really glad this came up because I think it is a huge part of what the cleavage is about. It's been for a long time now that women voters, especially women voters who care a lot about the issues that we think of as mattering a lot to women. So, women's access to healthcare, women's employment, and equal opportunities and equal pay, abortion, all those kinds of issues. Women who care a lot about those issues have increasingly been Democratic voters. Back when you're talking about the sort of, expansion of the franchise and the women's suffrage movement, it was, if anything, Republicans who were more supportive. But that's a different coalition than we have now. And the new coalition that both parties have had really since, the 70s and 80s, and definitely in, everything since 2000 has been that this turning in this direction. And then, but even then, it hasn't had that level of sort of masculinity and masculine identity that the current Republican image is really built around, and especially the Trumpism is built around. And it's a strange kind of masculinity that someone like Trump, who I think objectively just sort of doesn't look like he's that masculine and tough, but then he changes, and with the way his language works and the way he's portrayed is a different thing than the way he was if he was sitting across the table from you. And that kind of like masculinity toughness is a difficult thing to resist for a lot of voters. I think what Democrats tried to do in 2024 and may find a successful path later is to sort of re-describe a different kind of masculinity, a more inclusive fathers caring for their families, taking care, not being dominant, and all this sort of thing, which is what I think what like Tim Walz is trying to represent, and whether that was successful or not is a question. But I see the Democratic Party trying to do that to try to win back these male voters, and this like sense of a responsibility and not just masculine toughness. Whether or not that's politically the right path, I think Democrats are stuck with that's the direction, if anything, because Democrats and liberals believe that is the right way to think about being masculine, right? And so, it's not like these things are all just about electoral appeals. There's also ideological and principled difference on the roles that roles of gender and the ways in which gender and race and sex and all of these identities should play in daily life. And the Democrats represent a particular vision on that may cost them some young male voters in particular who don't embrace that.
So full disclosure, I think I am a bit of a pessimist, maybe even a fatalist. So take that as it were in this next question, which is, so I think parties, U.S. parties anyway, historically, some have, blinked in and out of existence. Some have been more enduring than others. And, when there are shifts amongst the electorate, it can be existential for parties such that they do actually collapse or they do fail, and then other parties fill that void, or they do evolve. Mm-hmm. And so there have been moments in the last decade or so in which I've wondered, this started with the Republican Party. I wondered if the Republican Party was on the verge of collapse and then would reformulate itself in some other type of constitution. But now I'm wondering the same of the Democratic Party, if that's the position they're in. And this is going to sound like a stupid question, but I guess I'm wondering if there are examples of existential party threats in which the party actually can evolve successfully and rebuild itself, or if there are more examples of parties just collapsing and then an experience of different parties rising up and taking their place.
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, in the United States, we have, because of both the two-party system and because of some, a number of other institutions that are sort of in place, it's very hard for new parties to emerge. And so, it's worth noting that we have had the same political parties in the United States since the Civil War, right? So we're talking about, a century and a half of the same parties. You look at other democracies, even other like major democracies, in which there are parties that have lasted a long time, right? Sort of long established democracy. There's still shifts and changes and new parties and adjustments and so forth. In the United States, we had the same two parties, and instead they have, as you were saying, they evolve, they change. And so the party of Lincoln is not the party of even the sort of late 1800s, not the Republican Party of the early 20th century, not the Republican Party today. And similarly, the Republican Democratic Party has evolved and shifted in different ways. And those evolutions and shifts include like moments where one party is just like clearly down. And the middle part of the 20th century, we essentially had what we'd call sort of a three-party system with Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats both uniting in the Democratic Party for a lot of procedural purposes and electing presidents and the like. And the Republican Party was this like, smaller element. And of course, now it's come back. So I think there's like shifts and changes, but like in a lot of real ways, like the label Democrat and Republican, those entities aren't the things that we really care about. It's really about the ability of a coalition to organize and to compete and to bring forward the issues that matter and everything else. And I think that there's a good chance that both, the important constituencies in the United States are going to struggle to get attention from either party going forward. On the other hand, who knows? Like there's a mixing and combining and so forth. It really does sort of call this kind of crisis moment, if you think that's what's happening now, sort of really calls attention to the fact that we do have a two-party system and that there's things that could happen in a multi-party system that we just don't see here. And we don't have a multi-party system for a whole host of reasons, like every possible explanation that you could have for why we don't get more parties. The United States has that explanation. So all of the things. So everything from our, electoral institutions to the fact that we have primaries to the kinds of cleavages that we have to everything. But there's a good case to be made that if we found a way to allow third and fourth parties to emerge, then the cleavages within the parties could be expressed in a way that didn't bring down the whole party in its electoral efforts.
We've lived through different eras in the United States, the eras in which, government and politics are shaped by different coalitions, different issues. I guess I'm wondering how you would characterize the forces that are shaping American politics today and maybe into the near future.
Well, I think that if you want to sort of sum it all up into some place, there's a populist movement, and it's around the world, that the parties are having a hard time reacting to. And part of it's because the populist movement, like all populist movements, has elements that are problematic. And so you don't want to just say, okay, we're just going to appeal to your, cultural identity as Americans, and we're going to trash experts and give you a commanding figure that you can get excited about, and that kind of thing, which is, one way in which you can kind of tap into this populism. But people are frustrated, and part of it's that the state where you're in with the current global economy, and people are struggling to succeed and struggling to have the kind of life that they thought they were going to have, things that they thought were guarantees or not so much guaranteed, and all the rest of it. And I don't know what we know how to deal with that. And so different parties are offering solutions that they're struggling with. But I do think that there are solutions, there are answers to this, and there are things that we can do to do better, helping working people and voters, and make them, give them the kinds of things that they're asking for. But the party system is struggling. I think the Republicans, as electorally speaking, the Republicans have done a better job because they've got a leader, an appeal that taps into things that frustrated populists want. But that comes, at perhaps the cost of some of the principles of democracy that we think are important, and certainly comes at a cost of appeals to racial identity and American identity that might be corrosive. Democrats are having a harder time appealing to this and trying to hold their coalition together. But that, I think, is the ultimate thing. And maybe I'm more of an optimist. I do feel like there is a solution that can be found for this, and that, will come out the back end of it with something that isn't a, return to a totalitarian period or something. Not that that's not on the menu, so to speak.
Well, to that point, and recognizing that you're an optimist and that you may have to some degree answered the question, but to put a fine point on it, through the lens of this conversation and your research, how concerned are you about liberal democracy in the United States?
I mean, I am pretty concerned, right? I mean, I say long term, things will get find someplace, but long term, Germany today is a thriving democracy and has a lot of success, and it went through a very tough period, right? So, it's long term. It could still be in the medium term, including the rest of my lifetime. Things could be really, really ugly. I think that there are a lot of people who are so frustrated with politics that they're willing to give up basic democratic principles like, congressional representation, and they don't respect the role that those things play. They don't understand the role that plays. And we don't do a very good job of defending that. So right now things look pretty grim. the source of optimism I have is that there are a lot of people who I see noticing this and are hoping to do something about it. My students, and this is partly what keeps me optimistic, is I talk to students who are, they see problems and they're frustrated and they're, don't have all the answers, but they want to do things about things. They want to respond. They want to push things into a new and better direction. And they don't always win, just like every other generation doesn't always win, but they are they're sort of ready for the fight. But I think a fight is coming.
Okay, final question. You ready for it?
Sure.
What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Sure. I love this kind of question, and I also never have a good answer for it. But since we've just been talking a lot about, sort of people struggling and class and everything else, I'll just say that I'm a pop culture guy, and I'm watching, shows and movies and everything else. And we just finished watching Severance, which I think is, first of all, it's just great. If you haven't seen it, you go check it out. It is really interesting. It's a really great story. The basic premise of it is that you could imagine separating your memories into the past, what you do at work and what you do outside of work, and basically have two identities that evolve forward. But the show is really a metaphor then for how our relationship is to work and what we do in our relationship to our bosses and our employers, and what our employers do to us. And so it's got a very sort of both populist element to it and an almost Marxist element to it in a lot of ways. And yet it's a white collar work environment that it depicts. And I'm pretty sure that the people who are watching it are mostly, more educated, not what we think of as sort of working class consumers. And I think that's telling that appeal of these kinds of clashes and the need to resist the man and the corporations and religions that are shaping our world is something that white collar, middle class, and upper middle class consumers find appealing. And I think that's because these same dynamics are sort of present, and these same concerns are present across everything. And that may be one of the difficulties that the Democratic Party has, is that it's sort of made up of people who watch Severance, but not people who actually live through the really difficult things that some people are living through, at least the leadership of the party. And so while they have empathy for the sort of fight that working class voters are having, they also see it on their own context, and they're having a hard time sort of figuring out how to address all of those questions. And so maybe it's everything I watch kind of ties back into the things that I'm thinking about. But I see a lot of that in Severance, which is also just a great show, and I'd recommend people see it.
I think you're making an interesting point here, because I've often wondered about shows that are carrying a much deeper kind of social and cultural point that I think have political components, or that would fit nicely in political arena for some type of attention. You're talking about Severance, but I also think about shows like Billions and even Succession that are really touching on, I think, issues, kind of across the electorate that are important to people. And I always find it fascinating when these are very popular shows, but they don't really generate some type of a movement around the issue that you'd think it might. Like, it does have its finger on a pulse, but it's not really moving beyond that. And I wonder if maybe you're hitting on the reason, and that is who the consumer is.
Yeah, that may be part of it. I think, it's a piece of it, but it's also, it's also true that people who have more leisure time, more free time to do other things, they're often the workhorses in political movements, at least in organizing, right? And they organize other people who then go on to do other stuff. But people, you need people to do organization. And so I think another possible explanation is that there's a lot of these, cultural things that tap into frustrations. And of course, you watch the show, and then it's like, okay, well, I had some expression of my concerns, and then maybe that's all that I have time for. And we don't have, meanwhile, institutions that are designed to sort of organize and bring that energy into politics. And here's where I think, the importance of political parties as institutions is often overlooked, where you need organizations to then bring people together and say, okay, we are the Democratic Party, and this is what we care about. And by the way, you saw this fight on severance the other day, and this should inspire you in this direction. We're the Republican Party, and we care about these things, and you saw this fight on whatever show that you're tapping into that is energizing you, maybe the same show, and it energizes you in this way. But our the sort of grassroots level party organizations are not as central to people's politics as they once were. I don't know how we build that back or whether it needs to be the parties per se, but that kind of institutional organization is the next step. And we do see it occasionally. I know that there are movements, in response to the Trump administration right now that are, building out institutions, but we don't have the kind of institutional capacity to do politics that the moment calls for.
Dr. Noel, thanks for being here. I truly appreciate the time.
Oh, thank you. This was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun.
If this conversation should make anything clear, it's this. The American party system is at a pivotal moment. The Republican Party's transformation into a Trumpist movement and the Democratic Party's struggle to find its footing signal deep shifts in our political landscape. Americans, we, hold power to shape this realignment by mobilizing within local party structures, by demanding accountability from leaders, and by supporting grassroots movements that prioritize democracy and inclusive governance over oligarchic and corrupting influence. Whether this moment leads to renewal, and it really could, or further polarization, which it also really could, depends on collective action to bridge existing divisions and sweep this Trump era into the dustbin of history. All right, check back next week for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.